We're here in Cannes, so I think we got to start with the ad market. It was pretty bleak for a while there. There have been big cuts in the tech sector. Then again, some folks are seeing signs of a turnaround. What are you seeing?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I never thought I'd have the opportunity to open for Kevin Hart, so this is a good, fun day for me. Yeah, so I think we're certainly not out of the woods yet, but the economy is more resilient than we expected. For example, in the United States, the consumer is still doing quite well, but businesses are experiencing a lot of cost pressures. I don't think those have abated, and so a lot of our advertising partners are very focused on efficiency, which is why we have been investing so heavily in our performance advertising platform. We've made a lot of changes, for example, improving the way people interact with ads and unifying ad interactions on our platform, improving the post-click experience, for example, and things like autofill which help with lead generation. And then, of course, rolling out much larger models that use a lot more data to show the right ad to the right person. So we're definitely seeing some progress on our platform, but not out of the woods yet.
Now, in addition to this win, one of the headwinds that we've been seeing in that ad industry have been the app tracking changes that Apple has made, limiting the ability to track without user consent. Are we past that yet? I mean, that's obviously been an impact for Snap.
Yeah, those changes certainly were disruptive as we expected, but we've made a lot of progress. We're certainly seeing a lot of advertisers, especially those in the e-commerce space, find a lot of success with our lower funnel products. We're continuing to improve our app-related products, but I think that's a little slower going. Overall, I think we've proven our ability to adapt and be resilient to these changes, largely because we built our advertising platform in a privacy-safe way from the very beginning. So we never allowed the sort of device-level targeting, for example, that other platforms allowed. And I think that those sort of that ethos and those values are reflected in these changes, which is why we've supported them from the beginning. So overall, I think this is better for our community, better for consumers more broadly on the internet, and we've been able to work through many of the challenges that these changes have posed to our business.
All right, so let's dig a little bit into AI. You launched an AI-powered chatbot, My AI, in Snapchat. It's widely available. I mean, you've had some 150 million people interacting with it. How do you see tools like that restacking the tech industry? I mean, Snapchat wasn't an AI chatbot, platform before, and we have Bing using AI chatbot to try to do search. I mean, we've had 10 companies, we've had 4 companies, kind of ruling the tech world. Is AI going to restack the tech industry?
I don't know about restack the tech industry. Certainly, a lot of these large businesses, including our own, have used AI for a very long time. So, most of the content and advertising, for example, that you see today on the internet's been recommended to you by machine learning. I think the big recent breakthrough with large language models has really changed the interaction paradigm or the user interface for computers and actually made it a lot more natural and easy to use. And I think it's part of that evolution from the command line to the graphical user interface to now conversational AI, which is a totally familiar way to interact with computers. So I do think this is a breakthrough in terms of a computer interface, and of course because Snapchat is a messaging app, we're really well positioned to offer large language models to help provide a new creative tool for our community and help people learn about the world around them. So we're really excited. 150 million people have used My AI since we launched it, I think about 2 months ago. They've sent over 10 billion messages about all sorts of things. I think there's been like 5 million conversations about McDonald's, tens of millions of conversations about cars and recommendations around what car to buy. So we're really excited to see that engagement. There's a great story we heard from someone in our community who used My AI to learn how to ask their boss for a raise. So they practiced talking back and forth and ended up getting an extra $5 an hour. So that was, I think, a very helpful way that My AI, is helping our community.
I mean, just as an example of how that restacking might happen, Google for a long time has had, in some ways, the inside track on intent signals, especially after Apple's changes. The question of what are people looking for, what do they want to buy? Well, they were searching for it on Google. Now that you have this window of people are talking about McDonald's, people are talking about cars, does that help make up for the lack of the app tracking data, or does that help even gain a step on search for you?
Yeah, my AI definitely helps provide a privacy-safe intent signal. When people are communicating with my AI, we can then use those insights to help improve recommendations across our platform, whether those are augmented reality experiences or the content people watch, and of course advertising as well. So I think my AI will increasingly provide very clear intent signal for our advertising platform and our platform more broadly. I think in terms of your question around restacking, I think philosophically, what we're really paying attention to is that a lot of software business models today are predicated on humans using software, right? And that's typically how people charge for software on a per seat basis. I think what's really fascinating about large language models is that increasingly AI is going to use software on your behalf. And I think that'll create a lot of opportunities in software, but it also could be quite disruptive for business models that are predicated on humans using software a lot. And I think it'll make all of our lives a lot better, because sometimes we use clunky pieces of software that we wish that AI could use on our behalf.
So AIs can just start using Snapchat too. They're gonna start sharing and sending messages. But seriously, you hired Rob Wilkie from Microsoft, Darshan Kantak from Google. Are you going after search ads?
Well, one of the things that we have done over the past year is hire regional presidents. So we figured out that it would be much more effective to get a real regional focus in our business. We were, I think, too focused on the United States, which represents the majority of our advertising revenue. So we hired Ajit Mohan to run APAC for us. He was leading India for Meta. We hired Ronan Harris to lead EMEA for us. He previously was running UK and Ireland for Google. And as you mentioned, we hired Rob, who was running global advertising for Microsoft, to oversee our business in the Americas. And that regional focus has been really helpful for us to really provide the level of support we want to our clients and be able to grow our business.
So no search ad revenue for you?
Well, I think people are maybe too focused on the ways that they believe that large language models could replace search. Large language models aren't a great search tool today because they just make stuff up a lot. So I think of them much more as a creative tool, a way to get inspiration, sometimes recommendations. But LLMs aren't great at the facts yet, but they'll get better over time.
Yeah, they definitely seem to get things wrong. My ask them about me. I guess I'm not very prominent. My bio is completely invented by AI systems. So then what's your view of the collective psyche from what people have been chatting about? I mean, beyond just talking about McDonald's, like what kinds of things, what kinds of conversations are people getting into with your tool?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people are using it as a creative tool. So, for example, I had to give a speech at Miranda's cousin's wedding, and on the way to the wedding, I took the speech I drafted and I dropped it into my AI, asked for some feedback and recommendations, had some great ones. I asked it to integrate those recommendations and rewrite it for me, and then send it back to me. And I was able to make a couple tweaks to make it a little bit more my own, but I actually really valued the feedback I got. So I think as a creative tool and a way to get inspiration, it's very helpful.
What kind of recommendations did it give?
It asked me to be a little more specific in a couple areas, which I thought was valid feedback.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. So this gets to an issue that is kind of been obsessing me lately, because I used ChatGPT a few months ago. I was really tired at the end of the day, and my kids asked me for a makeup story. I have a 6-year-old and an almost 9-year-old, and I was just like, tell me a story about 2 kids exploring Mars, like something I can tell my kids. And I did that, but what happens to human creativity when we start outsourcing that to machines?
Well, I think for us, we've always found that creative spark can really get amplified when you're in conversation with your friends, and now increasingly in conversation with AI. We see that all the time on our, in our design team, where people bounce ideas off each other, and it makes those ideas better. And certainly we use AI as a tool now just to generate mock-ups that can help us iterate on ideas a lot more effectively, a lot faster. So I think increasingly AI is going to be a very helpful creative tool, and that sort of iteration and dialogue, I think, actually enhances creativity rather than distracting from it.
I know, like, when I'm trying to find information, I tend to think of it these days in keywords because I've gotten trained by the format of a search engine. But that's not necessarily how the brain has to work. I mean, do you have a feeling of how it's going to change the way we think to have this kind of iterative creative partner?
Well, I think it's going to make it a lot more efficient to learn things, quickly. So, for example, the other day I don't wear suits very often, and I was wondering, how much cuff should you show, in your suit? And originally I was going to go search it online, but I realized I'm going to have to, comb through all these different websites and all these different recommendations. I was like, oh, I'm just going to ask my AI, of course. It's like, an eighth to a quarter of an inch would be appropriate, and that was it. Done. Lesson learned. And, and that, I think, was a good example of, it wasn't mission critical information. I wasn't writing an essay or anything like that, but I was able to get the information I needed really quickly.
You just have to hope it didn't hallucinate that answer. Turns out it has to be half an inch at least. So my AI is done in a partnership with OpenAI. What's your view on just the rollout of these tools? Some people say that there's a race going on and that they're being put out too quickly, and that safety issues are maybe being ignored. What's your feeling on that?
I think this technology has been developed, at least over the past 5 or so years. It's only recently gotten good enough that consumers really want to engage with it more broadly. So I think, actually, as we compare this to other technology products that have been rolled out over time, there's been a huge degree of thoughtfulness. I think folks have spent a lot of time investing in guardrails, for example, in terms of the way that AI works. And I think generally the industry as a whole has been working together to make sure that these products are safe. And so, when you compare this to other technology rollouts, I think this is probably one of the safer, more thoughtful, and more conservative ones, largely because, people watch the way that AI recommendation engines, I think spread misinformation and things like that on social media. And so folks are very focused on making sure that these sorts of AI rollouts are done in a safe and thoughtful way that supports, creativity and, of course, a healthy society.
I mean, your choice to put a chatbot in the hands of, say, a 13-year-old old enough to sign up for a social media service has been controversial. How do you handle that? I mean, how do you make a parent comfortable that this chatbot isn't going to, advise your kid to do something really unsafe or unhealthy?
I think first and foremost, we started by rolling out to a very, very small audience, just of Snapchat Plus subscribers. And we used that as an opportunity to learn about how the chatbot was working and when it was breaking. And that's how we started incorporating things like age signals. So letting the chatbot know the age of the person that they're communicating with to provide a more age-appropriate experience. We also created things like a timeout, for example. So if we see people, misusing our service, we just stop responding. The chatbot stops responding to them, and all of that's possible because we store all the communications that people have with our AI chatbot, so we can monitor them to make sure that the responses conform with our guidelines. And what we found is that more than 99.5% of all of my AI responses conform with our community guidelines. And in fact, anecdotally, when we look at the way that our communities communicating with my AI, we find that people are the ones who are saying much more inappropriate things than the chatbot itself.
Well, 0.5% is still not nothing. What kinds of things are you seeing that people are trying? Are people trying to egg the chatbot into doing inappropriate things? Is that what you're talking about?
When we break down that 0.5% further, a huge chunk of that is actually the chatbot just repeating an inappropriate thing that was said to it by someone using it. So we've definitely gone deep on the way that our community is interacting with my AI, and I think so far, of course it can be tricked into saying inappropriate things or, used inappropriately, but given the way that we're monitoring the service and the guardrails we've put in place, we certainly think it's a safe product, for our broader community.
As a parent, I was mentioning I have 2 kids. They're fast approaching social media age. We all know that screen time is a fraught topic in many households between kids and parents. What's your approach to these questions with your own kids?
We've been granted a brief reprieve because Flynn, our 12-year-old, left his phone in Australia over spring break, and we have declined to get him a new one. So,
How old was he when he got a phone?
he just got one, 12 in middle school. And he generally uses his computer. So he is on YouTube. He does play Roblox and uses iMessage to communicate with his friends. We were a no screen time household prior to the pandemic, but in the pandemic, it was really the only way that he could stay in touch with his friends. And so that dam broke, and we have not looked back.
And so at what age what age do you expect them to get Snapchat accounts?
Well, certainly no younger than 13, because that would be against the rules.
But 13, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's a really great way to stay in touch with friends and family. We've got some awesome family group chats going, with my sisters, for example, and of course, the grandparents. So he'll I think, really enjoy being a part of those as soon as he turns 13.
What's your biggest concern about their being on social media?
I think my biggest concern overall with the internet is just, unfiltered access to all sorts of information. And I think especially for young people, that means that critical thinking skills are so important. So I know that schools, spend a lot of time teaching that these days, but at home we really try to spend a lot of time around the dinner table, answering Flynn's questions or talking about what he's learned online or the conversations he's having with friends. And I think that sort of, critical thinking and context building in an open conversation with Flynn can support healthy use of the internet, and also, encourage him to question things when he sees them, because not everything, of course, on the internet is true.
All right, so let's take a break from AI for a second and talk about the last shiny thing. I think it was a huge subject of conversation a year ago. The metaverse. Is the metaverse over?
Not yet. Yeah, I think there's obviously been a lot of excitement around virtual reality. We haven't invested at all in virtual reality as a business. We've focused entirely on augmented reality. And what we've seen to date is that the audience for augmented reality, the user base of augmented reality, far exceeds the user base of virtual reality. And we believe that's because people like being grounded in the real world when they're using computing, but also because augmented reality is much more useful. So today we've made our augmented reality tools available to retailers, for example, so they can embed our AR technology in their own apps and websites. We find that then people can use those tools to try on their products, and it improves consideration with their different products, and of course can lead to higher conversions as well. And so I think AR is already a part of so many people's day-to-day lives. On Snapchat alone, I think there's 250 million people who use AR every single day. And so we're really excited about what we're seeing, in AR, of course, on the smartphone, but then in the longer-term future with wearables.
Every single day, doing what are some of the main things they're doing?
Well, a lot of times they're playing around with their friends and expressing themselves. So people use, our lenses to change the way that they look. I was sending a little video to our kids this morning. There was a great lens in my carousel that allows you to be a lion. And our littlest, Miles, loves lions. So he was getting a kick out of that.
But when it comes to your spectacles, how big a market do you see for that eventually?
Over the long term, I think it's going to be very, very large, perhaps as large as the smartphone market is today, for example, just because it makes computing much more immersive. People, if you look at the arc of development in computing, we talked about the user interface. We didn't talk about the form factor, which went from the mainframe to the desktop, the laptop, now the phone in everyone's pocket. But we're still walking around staring down at this little screen or stuck behind our desk. And I think the promise of AR and the promise of wearables is that you can get all the value of computing, but you can also integrate it in the world around you and share that together with friends. And so I think technology today can feel very isolating. It can feel like it gets in the way. And AR promises, to, I think, provide those computing benefits, but together in the real world.
Have you had a chance to play with Apple's Vision Pro?
I haven't yet. No, I'm very excited to try it out.
What are your thoughts on that product?
It's certainly very expensive. No, it's cool to see more people experimenting with VR. Certainly, they're looking at elements of pass through virtual reality to allow you to see the real world at the same time that you're using some of the apps and whatnot that they have on that device. But it's far too early to tell, and I won't know more until I can get my hands on it.
I mean, it's true that it's sort of like virtual AR with the being able to see through. But as there are more AR devices, do you see yourself building versions of Snapchat that would work on other devices like that?
Yeah, certainly. We'd love to be able to make our lenses available on as many devices as possible. But what we found in our research, and as we've worked on our own wearables, the difference between pass-through augmented reality, which is where you use a VR device to kind of look at screens that show you what the rest of the world looks like, and see-through augmented reality, where you wear see-through glasses and the computing is displayed in the world around you, the difference is just enormous. And so, we'll have to see if we can make a really compelling product experience for pass-through augmented reality, which in the past has been difficult for us on other VR devices that we've experimented with.
All right. A few rapid-fire questions. This is an easy one. What's your prognosis for Twitter?
I think we've all learned to never count Elon out. So, I'll be excited to see what he does with the platform. He's clearly got a ton of big ideas, and, TBD.
Have you benefited from the advertiser exodus that they've suffered?
Not really. Their advertising products and their audience are so different than Snap. We reach more than 75% of 13 to 34-year-olds in more than 20 countries. We offer, performance and video products and, of course, augmented reality. I think Twitter gravitated historically much more towards brand advertising budgets and largely for a different and, frankly, smaller audience. So I don't know if, we've been directly competitive, but I think advertisers have certainly pocketed some of those Twitter advertising dollars in this economic, through these economic challenges that maybe they would have pulled from us instead. I'm not sure.
The cuts there have been extreme, and yet the app remains up and running. I mean, is there an example for Silicon Valley that maybe, some of these companies don't need quite so many people?
I think if their revenue had remained, maybe, what's the right way to say this, higher, then I think some of the changes may have made more sense because it would have resulted in more earnings. I think the challenge is, when you make the really difficult and painful decision to restructure a business like that, you hope that you can generate more earnings to then, be able to reinvest or return to shareholders, et cetera. And I think, unfortunately, in the case of some of those changes, they also resulted in much lower, revenue. So I'm not sure it had the intended effect of boosting earnings the way that maybe you typically would want to when you restructure a business.
Twitter, like you, but also like Meta, have subscription offerings that you're now getting into. Wall Street Journal, we've long been advocates of the subscription model. We also sell ads. It's a perennial debate in the media business. What do you see as the right balance for ads versus subscription dollars?
Well, we really are having a lot of fun building out our subscription business. It now reaches 3 million Snapchat Plus subscribers. I think the product launched less than a year ago. And what's been really fun about it, it's allowed us to innovate and focus on, people who just love our products, our power users, so to say, people who use the service, 90 of 90 days, for example, who really love Snapchat. And so it's allowed us to really innovate and build products specifically for them, whether it's things like priority story replies so that your favorite creator sees your reply first, or an app theme or a custom app icon, for example, or new tools for My AI. So for example, if you're a Snapchat Plus subscriber and you send a snap to My AI, your AI will actually send a snap back to you, a generative snap, which is really fun. People are enjoying that. So I think it's been great to be able to innovate for the most engaged members of our community. And then of course from a business perspective, advertising can be a cyclical business, and tends to kind of surf the economy, so to say. And I think subscription revenue for us will provide a nice kind of consistent base of revenue that maybe can help offset some of the, the ups and downs of the advertising business that we've experienced over time.
What percentage of your revenue long-term do you see coming from subscriptions?
It's too hard to say this early. We've set an ambitious midterm goal of trying to get to 10 million subscribers, which would still be very small relative to our advertising revenue. But I think I think there's some potential here, and we'll continue to invest.
Another app, a competitor of yours, TikTok, has been facing calls in the U.S. for a ban. You've said that short term you think that would benefit you. Is that a source of advertising dollars for you?
Gosh, so it's so hard to say. Of course, the more that people learn, the more concerned they get. But I think there's a bit of a standoff now where many folks in the U.S. government would like TikTok to be divested, and of course the Chinese government really doesn't want to see that happen. So it's not clear what will happen next. Of course, we do compete with TikTok for advertising dollars, although I think what we hear from our partners is that they really find a lot of value in our performance offerings. They appreciate that we have a moderated broadcast content platform, so we control the content that's distributed widely on our platform, and I think brands really like to appear in that sort of environment. I think the bigger issue here, though, is that we need a framework to engage with China. We need more guardrails, I think, in the United States around how U.S. businesses and Chinese businesses interact so that we can preserve the good parts of the U.S.-China relationship that have led to an enormous amount of economic growth over a long period of time. So I think the challenge right now is the uncertainty in the United States, and the volatility is contributing to a more unstable U.S.-China relationship. And the faster we can get U.S. businesses working together with Chinese businesses and the U.S. and China governments to work together and kind of create a framework for that sort of economic relationship, I think the better we'll all be.
Some buyers have said that they're surprised, though, that you haven't pushed harder on these issues and to try to win away ad dollars. Why aren't you pushing harder on it?
I think we've always tried to, sell our advertising products based on their efficacy. And that's one of the great things about performance advertising. If we can show return on investment to our advertising partners, they'll spend more and buy more of our products. And so just focusing on the value we can drive for our advertising partners has been the way we've grown our business over time.
And what, would be the danger if that app were banned? I mean, if TikTok were banned, you would benefit in the short term. Is there a long-term cost to that?
I think the long-term cost, for example, could be an escalation in what is already a seemingly unstable U.S.-China relationship. I know there have been recent efforts to try to bridge those divides, but it seems increasingly like we're on a collision course, which is why I do think it is so important to put together an economic framework so that U.S. and Chinese businesses can continue to grow, continue to serve their customers, while still, of course, protecting national security of both countries.
Well, we have about a minute or two left. I don't know if there's time for any there's one or two questions from the audience. If anybody has a question for Evan here.
Hey, Evan. Sid Wilson. I'm the CEO of the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility in Washington, D.C. By the way, Fidel Vargas is a great guy on your board of directors. So thank you for board diversity that you have on Snap. My question is similar on D&I. How does AI going to impact the movement for greater diversity and inclusion in Silicon Valley? And how is AI integrating that when you think about people of color and how they answer those questions?
It's a really big question. So let me give you one example of where I think AI can actually make a massive difference. So for example, we've long used artificial intelligence to build lenses, augmented reality lenses in Snapchat. One of the things that we found as we were building those lenses is that there's not a lot of artwork out there, for example, as we look at really broad data sets that represents underrepresented groups. And that's hugely problematic because as we try to build lenses for people who live in India or live in Africa or live in different places all around the world, sometimes those lenses wouldn't perform the way that we wanted or the way that we expected because the data sets were limited. So we started using artificial intelligence to generate synthetic data sets so that we could grow the training set of data that we were training on to be more representative of all the people around the world that we serve, even though there weren't necessarily all of the, artifacts, so to say, historically, that represented all of those different cultures that we could train on. And so I think our use of synthetic data, for example, is one way that AI can actually make a really big difference, making products that better serve more people all around the world.
We have time for one more question. Right here in the front.
Hi, my name is Sophia and I run an education company. So I have a question to you about education. What is your view on hiring MBAs to work at Snap? Because traditionally, Silicon Valley doesn't really like MBAs, and what are your thoughts?
Well, I think, one of the things that Silicon Valley has always been a bit skeptical about, frankly, are just degrees in general. Because largely, I think what we've found is that people from all different backgrounds with all sorts of different degrees or without degrees are able to create absolutely amazing things, learn how to program, design, of course, build incredible technology products. So I don't think there's anything against MBAs specifically, but I do think there's a general acknowledgement in Silicon Valley that creativity and talent can come from anywhere. And so it's not about, what's on your resume, for example, that necessarily matters. It's really about what you can create and frankly, how rapidly you can grow and evolve as a person to keep pace with the evolution of the business.